Shalom everyone, you're here again with a special recording for Hebrew in Israel. Lately I've been using a new microphone and I've been playing around with the settings, so hopefully the sound is more superior than what I've used up to now. And hopefully we'll be able to give everyone not only good quality information, but also good quality sound and video. In any case, I have been asked by several people, personally, people who follow my work, and they asked me a question regarding prayer. Do we have to pray? What is prayer? How does prayer fit into the world of Torah? And other questions like that. Now, I'm going to try to touch on as many things that I can, but we will be able to do some follow-ups, especially if people send me questions. I'll be able to compile answers and answer these questions and give them out in audio recordings. And also, by the way, I'm working on, the moment I'm done with exams, I'll actually also go and do some work on uploading these recordings to iTunes, so you'll be able to download them. I know that at the moment on YouTube and on my website, you cannot download the recordings. My apologies. I know people, it's much more comfortable for them. I didn't think about this. I thought you were able to download. Apparently you cannot, and I will rectify this the moment I can, so my apologies. But if anyone needs a specific recording, I can send you a file via Dropbox for now, and you'll receive them. So I don't mind doing personal requests at the moment, because yes, I did create a bit of an issue here. But in any case, there is a way of solving it, so let me know if you listen to this and you want specific recordings. In any case, tefillah, prayer. First of all, the first thing, actually, I think one of the reasons that this came up was because a specific rabbi, who I actually know personally, came out with a video regarding prayer, and he based a lot of what he says on Kabbalistic writings, which, as most of you know, I am very, very careful with, and I think that everyone out there needs to be careful, and this was the practice for many, 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 many centuries, and then this practice was breached, and people started teaching this more in public, and in my personal opinion, I think that this was a major mistake. People make the argument of, no, but this is time for that spiritual revelation. My response to this is, I'm not convinced. I think it's created more issues than others. But also, on the other hand, I understand the need for people for spirituality. So the discussion of Kabbalah is a different discussion that I actually made a video about, a recording about. But it's a tricky subject and a very touchy one for many people, because some feel very connected to it, some people are very against it, and it's an interesting place to have to dance around with. But I will say that the tradition I come from as a Jew is that Kabbalah is only something for people who are great sages and not for the general public, and that's one of the arguments that went on in the 1700s with the Chassidut, because they were teaching this to the layman, where really the Talmud says that you need to be able to be a great sage, to fill his belly, which is a metaphor, with meat and wine, which means good quality food, which entails the idea of good quality information, to really become a sage. This idea of the spiritual revelation that opens up different things is something that can be contested, and I think the sages contested this as well with their arguments against prophecy at their time in the Second Temple and the Roman era. And I think that the fact remains that we need to be very careful, because some of these teachings showed up almost out of nowhere. So it's a little tricky. I'm not going to explain it now on one leg, but it's a little tricky, this subject. And we know that these things existed for a very long time, but we can't vouch for all the teachings which come out, all the teachers that teach these things. So it's a little tricky. It's better off to have information that's open, that's in front of everyone. The same way the Torah says, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, and then it starts describing things about the priests. That the Torah, unlike the rest of the ancient world, when things were part of the cultic sphere, which in many cases was also the mythology, the mysticism, the cosmology of these different practices. I can't really call them religions, but these faiths, that these religions, these national gods that people had, many things were in the realm of the secret, where Torah actually puts everything out in the open. So there actually is a massive difference. There are some other questions, but I'm not going to address it here. So this video came out, and I think that some things that were said were misunderstood. Though I did see the listing and actually read the material that this specific rabbi used to prove his opinion, and at the end of the day, I have to say, yes, that's the opinion presented in these writings, and it is his legitimate stand to say these things. And I am not here to contest what he said. He bases what he says on material, and I'm perfectly fine with that. So this is not an attack on him or anything that he said. This is just giving another perspective. As everyone knows, my opinion is get as many perspectives as possible. Obviously, try to sift out the ones that are not based, do not have a good background. You don't have to have a degree or even official training to be able to be a good scholar. As another historian said to me, someone who's already almost into his 80s, well into his 70s, said to me that he's seen people with PhDs which are complete morons. So this is not the point. Also, my approach is always very academic, though I do have a lot of background in rabbinic studies. I went to yeshiva for many years and so on. Wouldn't say I was the best student, but apparently there were quite a few rabbis who were very impressed with the way I think. So I know that I've received some vouching from people who are ordained rabbis who have been around for quite a while, who said that many of the things that I say are very correct. So I know that I can stand here and say things with authority, but obviously I have to be very careful. No, I'm not a rabbi, period. That's the one thing I have to say. So in any case, going back to the subject of prayer, after I've given my disclaimer, first of all, the root prayer. The root for prayer is palal, pei lamed lamed. Palal actually comes from the legal system. For example, it says in Exodus that if there's a debate between different people, it says they use plilim. If a husband is suing someone, natan b'flilim. If a man strikes a woman and she loses her children, and the children die, or the child dies, the fetus dies, the husband does a very simple action, which is natan b'flilim. I've actually read several articles by different scholars regarding the judicial system, and plilim is very clearly, to this very day in Israel, the term plilim is usually an act that brings you at the end in front of a judge. Usually there'll be a trial in such a situation. So the word actually has not changed at all. So the root, the word for tefillah is the noun form of it. Lehitpalel is a reflexive form. Specifically was a mistake regarding the hitpalel. Lehitpalel is a reflexive form. What's called intensive reflexive. It can be considered a way of one acting one upon oneself, or someone is acting together with someone else. In the form palal, usually it means that someone goes before someone of authority and files a request. So tefillah, if we translate it correctly, means to request. Lehitpalel means to petition in front of someone else, which means it's not passive reflexive, it's not one does one to oneself, but actually one does something towards someone else, and the someone else is involved in this. Now, usually reflexive forms of the hitpalel form are ones where the two sides are doing something very similar to one another. But reflexive forms have a lot of different ways of appearing, and therefore it can be said, and I stand behind this opinion, is that lehitpalel actually means that both sides are active because one has to speak and the other one has to listen. And that is the reflexive state or the reflexive idea behind lehitpalel. So it's not a passive reflexive, it's not one does one to oneself, but actually one does to someone else, and someone else responds to it or reacts in some way or another. Because one can speak, and it can be ledaber or diber or hishmiya in the Hifi, one made one's voice heard, but it doesn't necessarily mean the other side listens. This is why it has to appear in the hitpa'el form to indicate that the other side is also participating. You have to be a little bit more dynamic when you understand Hebrew. This is why most of my students, actually all my students, really, really like the way I teach, because one of the things that I show is the dynamic aspect of understanding Hebrew. In any case, so we've understood the root. The root is to petition, comes from the legal system, and we've understood the main form that to prayer appears in, which is lehitpalel. The form itself, the nominal form tfilah, is again a feminine form with the a at the end, and the prefixed noun nominal form of tav, and then we have pei lamed, yud in the middle, which is only just a vowel point, pei lamed, but it's basically we can call a weak verb in this case, where one of the lameds is gone, not something special happens. And prayer itself, there's an interesting debate in rabbinic sources. Is prayer actually commanded in the Torah? And they work off of the idea, Nachmanides, for example, speaks of that prayer is not commanded. If I remember correctly, prayer is not commanded, but it's hinted in other places. While Maimonides actually says, no, it's actually a positive commandment. In the book of Amidah, which is the first book of the writings of Maimonides, he has a section there about prayer, and he says it is a commandment to pray. Positive commandment to pray. So, from the rabbinic standpoint of the sages of halakha, not Kabbalah, but the sages of halakha, prayer is expected. You are expected to pray, which is the exact opposite of what we heard from the specific teaching that came out. You are commanded to pray, or at least you are expected to pray. It's not only there, it's also in the Talmud and a lot of other places. So we need to understand what's this idea of you're not supposed to pray. So I am going to step in here into what this rabbi said, but again, it's not an attack on him. It has to be very, very clear. The sources used by this specific rabbi are Kabbalistic sources that take a very interesting approach regarding prayer being very central to the spiritual realm of Kabbalah and Judaism in general. And the idea that stands behind it is that we are to some degree unworthy because prayer is one of the highest, purest forms of an action towards God, and therefore our prayers are like contaminated words that should not appear before God. That's the gist of what's said there. I'm not going to go into the great detail because it's not the point. The point is to try to say what the Tanakh says about the subject. And actually, I can't really comment on such an idea because not only do we not find this idea in the authoritative, the ones which are accepted by everyone in Judaism, it's also an idea that I can't prove or disprove. It falls into the spiritual realm, which I do not have the ability to prove or disprove. I know several Kabbalists, and they would pray in any situation. These are people who are practicing Kabbalists. I actually had a neighbor. I was actually a neighbor of Rabbi Avichai, who is the head of Yeshivat Bet El, and the main Kabbalist yeshiva in Jerusalem in the Old City. And then we spoke about this, and he said, no, they pray all the time. They don't limit themselves in any situation. They'll pray like everyone else. So it's very important to separate between the esoteric sides of things and the spiritual comments which are made by Kabbalists versus the actual practice. What Rabbi Avichai said to me was very, very simple. He said to me that you cannot undermine halakha because of a Kabbalistic idea. The specific discussion came up. We were actually building our sukkot, and then we built the booths not too far away from one another. And we spoke about this, and he asked me if I was Chabad, and I answered no. And he said to me, oh, because I thought you don't sleep in your sukkah. And I said, no, I do. I do sleep in my sukkah. And he even, he said, oh, okay. And we spoke about this very quickly. And he made this comment that, with all due respect, even if you have some kind of a Kabbalistic idea, you cannot cancel halakha. And I told him, yes, I totally agree with that. It's actually something the son of the Rambam, Rabbi Avraham ben HaRambam, or Rabbi Avraham ben Moshe Maimon, wrote in his book regarding spiritual guidance. Very, very interesting book. Very influenced by the Sufi way of thinking, which is something you cannot avoid. And what we find there is he says that no matter what, even if Joshua decides not to wear tzitzit, he uses these examples. If one great leader of Israel, even like someone who's the level of a prophet like Moses or Joshua or whomever, cancels out a mitzvah, cancels out a positive commandment, they have to be held to this action. And this, by the way, this issue of canceling out a commandment bothered a lot of rabbis. A lot of sages had an issue with this idea, because what they had to deal with was the fact that there are some places that, based on the way Pharisaic halacha understood things, these specific characters broke Torah. For example, Elijah at Mount Carmel. But I actually have a comment about that, which I will make actually in a recording I'm planning on the whole story of Elijah at Mount Carmel, explaining certain issues, not the story itself, but explaining certain halachic issues that might have existed there. For those who don't know, I also live not too far away from Mount Carmel, so I grew up with Mount Carmel in the background of my life as a child, and then now living back in the town I grew up in, I have Mount Carmel in my backdrop all the time, at any given moment, because it dominates the area. I mean, you can travel all the way to Acre, all the way to far away to Naharia, and you'll still see Mount Carmel. It's just there. But in any case, the point that he made was that, with all due respect, you still have to keep Torah. If you're commanded to do something, you still have to do it, no matter what the spiritual idea is behind it. So this is a very important point, and this was actually told to me by a very prominent Kabbalist that is the head of one of the major yeshivot in Jerusalem, Kabbalistic yeshivot. So I actually do have people that I'm in contact with that can help me out with things like this. So now we've moved this out of the way, we need to ask ourselves a very simple question. Does the Torah say we have to pray? And what does it mean to pray? So first of all, the Torah doesn't say anything about having to pray. It doesn't say you have to pray. Why? Because prayer is a very, very personal thing. The Torah doesn't give you stipulations of how to pray. What are the words you're supposed to say? Are there any specific formulas? And so on. The Torah deals a lot with the public sphere. Though many things that we do are in our private lives at home, the issue is that the keeping of the Torah in the Torah itself, or at least the way I understand it, is mostly presented in the public sphere, in the public idea. We have responsibility towards one another to make sure we keep the Torah. And most of the time, things are in public. I mean, today we have a lot of privacy. Back then, privacy wasn't that simple. People didn't live in houses where they can be broken off from everyone else. And people mostly, if they wanted to live by themselves, they would travel into the desert or live in a cave somewhere. But people who lived in villages usually also had their relatives as neighbors. This is why, for example, the Torah says that if your relative tells you to go worship another god, why relative? Why not just your neighbor? The thing is, most cases, your neighbor was your relative. So usually when someone does something which is against Torah, it's anyhow brought in some way or another to the public. And then they have the whole question about Lashon Hara and Rechilut, and things like that, and that's another question by itself that we might address some other time. But it seems to be the whole idea of speak to the children of Israel makes everything extremely public, very in the open. Prayer is not mentioned anywhere, and it makes you wonder. And it makes you wonder why it's not mentioned anywhere. And I think that if we take this approach of the public sphere of practices of Torah, it means that in the temple, where the religious practice is done, and where in most cases in the ancient world prayer was done, prayer was not expected. But we see people pray. We see people pray all the time in the Bible. I would say, as you can hear from what I'm saying here, it's a little tricky, because there's no mentioning. When you're trying to understand why there's no mentioning, there are some midrashim that say, to love God in your heart, what is the worship of the heart? That's prayer. Okay. I would say that's part of it. And maybe that's the answer. The Torah is here to teach us the ways, the deeds which we're expected to do. And these deeds mostly fall, as I said, in what we will call the public sphere. I mean, there are, again, a lot of things which can fall in the personal sphere, in your personal life, but many of these things anyhow come out in the open. Really, if you go over the commandments of the Torah, even things like keeping kosher, okay? It still be something, because if you go out hunting, it's outside. People prepared their meat, it was outside. And people also had responsibility. If someone's breaking Torah, it's the responsibility of the community to take care of it. When someone, for example, steals, in our world, someone steals, commits some heinous crimes, murders and everything, it's done in public, because this is a disturbance of the public sphere. We tend to think a lot of things in an individualized manner because of what happened later on, what happened in Greco-Roman times, the rise of the individual, that the individual has a personal relationship with the king. But Israel, in essence, has a public relationship with the king. This is a very, very big difference than what most of us actually think of. There are many characters in the Bible that have personal relationships with God. And I don't think that this takes away of your personal relationship. I don't think that God only looks at us as a group. But in essence, I have a friend who did research on this, and he actually said that what he found was that the majority of Jewish sages that speak about God's intervention in the world usually speak about something more in the generalized public sphere and not the personal sphere. But we also cannot ignore the fact that we have things in our personal life that happen if we request them and so on. So the Torah itself doesn't speak about prayer because prayer is not part of the public sphere. However, as I said, we find a lot of people who pray. And what's interesting is most of these prayers are done in a personal manner. So prayer, based on what we mostly find in the Bible, like Hannah and David and Chizkiyahu, and other characters that we find, Moshe, for example, he prays for his sister, Elna Refanala. He doesn't go out to the public sphere. He doesn't go out to everyone and say, oh, my sister's sick, everyone pray for her, like we do today. He turns around to God by himself and says, Elna Refanala. He doesn't go anywhere beyond that. We hear Moshe praying in behalf of the people, but it's again him by himself before God. The only situations that we hear a public prayer are in very important stages. For example, when there's an ordeal, there's a danger, so the entire people will yell out to God. That's like a crying out to the king in a certain situation. That's a unique situation. We find public prayer or public practices, for example, in times of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they do the new covenant, when they try to renew Torah amongst the people, they make something public. But I find it, and again, I don't know the Bible is back of my hand, so if I'm wrong here, please correct me. But as far as I can tell, most of the prayer is private prayer. And this is why the Torah doesn't go into it. But it is expected that people pray because it is a basic, elementary concept of faith. You have a God, you believe in a God, that it's there, He's there for you. He provides you. So naturally people turn around to their God and say, God, please help me. It's just a natural thing. It's not something that needs to be explained. The same way you eat and drink and walk around and work, you pray. It's one of these, what's called muskal rishon. It's an idea. Muskal rishon basically means a basic concept that everyone understands. There are things that you do. There are things you don't do. Things that come to us naturally. So even if there's no commandment in the Torah to pray, I would say very bluntly, there is. There is a commandment to pray based on the idea that it is a basic concept, a fundamental idea of faith. But again, in the sphere of the temple, in the sphere of what the Torah speaks about, not just temple, but everyday life as well, most of it is in the public sphere. And therefore Torah doesn't talk about it, because Torah has its own rulings of how to do things. Did the priest have liturgy in the temple? There is an opinion that says so. That there were things that the priest would say. You have public declarations, like for example, the confession of the tithe, which appears in Deuteronomy, the end of Deuteronomy. Vidui Masrot. It's still something that's done in public. Yes, it deals with you as a person personally, but it still falls in the public sphere. Tithing, for example, though is a personal thing that one decides to do or not do out of their own whatever income. I'm going to use this word income in general because farming is also the income. If you don't do it, the Levites will know. They never saw you that day. And there's a public responsibility because we are in a covenant as a group. Certain people do things personally before God, but the Torah is more of a covenant as a group. So in any case, and now my neighbor is doing some drilling, so you can probably hear at least some of it when I go quiet for a second, so I do apologize. And the thing that comes up now is, now that we say there's no stipulations of what to say in prayer, how we decide what to say? And the answer is, each person says whatever he wants, he or she wants. Maimonides, for example, when he goes over the concept of prayer, and I think that he's spot on in this description, he says very clearly, it used to be that people knew what to say. They would say because they knew Hebrew and they were able to speak what they have on their hearts, and they said what they needed, and they prayed in some way or another, and that was prayer. Later on in time, people didn't know Hebrew that well, and they tried to pray, and they weren't too sure, so people started creating official liturgy that people can use. But we're going a little bit ahead of ourselves. So there is no stipulation exactly how to pray. There's no protocol that's mentioned in the Torah how to pray. There's no system given to us how things are done. So where do we go to from this? We go to the courts. We go to a court, and we see what was done in the court. What's interesting is that in a court, usually when someone has an issue, he goes before the king or the judge. Kings are important to the protocol here as well. You would go to the king or the judge, and he would cry out to him. You cry out to him, and this description appears in several places in Tanakh, and you cry out to him. He turns around to you. You present the situation. You petition your request, and you give a thank you before he does anything. And when he does it, you thank, and when he says yes or no, you thank him again. Okay, this is based on a description I read about the judicial system in Israel. On the description, I will give the sources that I used here. And so though we don't find in the Torah itself a protocol of how to pray, we find in different places around the Bible things which are similar, things that give us some kind of a structure. Usually you have to turn around, you present the problem, present the petition, and then give your thanks. This is quite a structure that we can find in most places. We can't take the prayer of Moses, Elna Refanallah, because that is a cry out. That's already a slightly different structure here. It's an emergency. In an emergency, you just scream out. But in situations where there's a bit of structure that you can present, then that seems to be the structure. Intriguingly enough, the Jewish liturgy is built in a very, very similar system. You say, Adonai Sefatai Tiftahu Fi Agiti Latecha. You turn around to God. You attract His attention. You give a presentation of information, the blessings in the beginning. If we talk about the Amidah, the blessings in the beginning that glorify God, which is also, again, attraction of attention. You have petitioning of, why do I even stand before you? Well, I am a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I believe in you. I believe that you're all-powerful and holy. Then you present your request. There's a thanks in the end. Okay, and the Oseh Shalom, the last prayer, the last benediction in the Amidah, is, though a request for peace, is also a recognition of the power of God. Because a king, one of the things a king's supposed to do is bring peace. So it's a recognition of his authority. So it's interesting how rabbinic prayer actually fits very well into this liturgy and this structure that we find in the Torah. Torah, the Tanakh in general. We use that as a generalized concept. So there actually is some kind of a protocol. There is some kind of a structure. However, do you have to follow this structure? Or do you actually have to follow a specific liturgy? In Jewish practice, the answer is most definitely yes. But that's because Judaism tends to sanctify anything that was created by anyone that lived sometime before us. It's a practice that's there to preserve, a very important practice it's there to preserve. So in my personal prayers, I use the Jewish liturgy because it's just my culture. This is what I do as a person. This is my culture as a person. But it's interesting that Rabbi Nachman of Breslev actually tried to, we're talking about the late 1700s, actually wanted to reintroduce the idea of praying by yourself, praying as a personal prayer. And he speaks a lot about the idea of requesting with your own language, talking to God in your own tongue, in your own words, a more personalized type of prayer. And he emphasizes this greatly. I lived with a lot of Breslev people when I was living in Samaria, and I saw this on a daily basis. They had regular prayers, they had special prayers which were composed by different rabbis in Breslev, and then they sometimes would take time at the end to give their own prayer. And you know what? We find this in the Talmud. What's interesting that this was actually given as part of liturgy, but the end sections, if you look at the Siddur, at the end sections, there are several little prayers at the end, and these are actually prayers of specific sages. I think one is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the other one is someone else. And these are personal prayers that they added. And the Talmud specifically says that when you're done with Oseh Shalom, when you're done with the last prayer, if it's 18 or 19, depending where you're from, that's where you give your prayer. But there's a bit of a mistake in the Sidurim because the Yehi Ratzon Imre Fi V'Yon B'Lifanecha Adonai Tzori V'Goali. May my words be accepted. May the words of my mouth be accepted. I can't remember the exact. It's not coming to me the translation, but that there's like a last section there that you say. There's a last section there at the end. If you open up your Siddur, you see it appears twice, just after Oseh Shalom and after everything else. So actually, you're supposed to say the Yehuda Ratzon Imre Fi V'Yon B'Lifanecha Adonai Tzori V'Goali. It says, my Lord, my strong place and my Savior. That's actually supposed to show up at the end after your personal request. For some reason, the printers decided to print this twice for no apparent reason, because the moment you say the Yehi Ratzon, you've actually ended your prayer. That's what Talmud says. You're supposed to say all your personal requests after He who brings peace, but before the Yehi Ratzon. And that's where these different sages will place this in their prayer, in their personal prayer. So that actually, even in Jewish liturgy, there actually is a window for personal prayer as well. So Rabbi Nachman didn't really make anything up. It was always there. It's just because of us getting used to certain practices and doing certain things in certain ways, we forget, we miss out, we don't see it, we don't know. We're just used to a structure that puts us into a very specific place. So we actually find this as well. Another question that comes up is the need for a Minyan for 10 people. And the issue is, first of all, we don't find anything like this in the Tanakh. Although there are midrashim that speak about the idea of Amidah and so on, we actually don't find anywhere in the Tanakh a prayer as a public obligation. And therefore, it is very difficult to even talk about the concept of a Minyan. But a Minyan means 10 men, 10 adult free men. Talking about this material comes out of a period when there was still slavery and half slavery and things like that. So 10 free men over the age of 13 are led by a leader of prayer that has to be over the age of 20 or has a beard, or both. And if they're above 20, then even without a beard, they can lead the community in prayer, but it has to be over the age of 20, by the way. It's not before that. Usually when they have a child leading prayer in synagogues, a teenager, that's actually a problem. It's against the practices of halacha, and also even against what the Torah says. The Torah says from the age of 21 becomes a member of community. 13 might be the age when we start saying, oh, they have to keep the commandments fully, but 20 is when a person can represent the community, and not before that. But the Minyan is something that appears much, much later. But it has to do with the concept of public prayer, of doing things publicly. But here's the split. This is something important that needs to be understood, how something non-biblical can show up in something that most of us perceive as biblical. The answer is the concept of the synagogue, the Bet Knesset. The Bet Knesset is a Second Temple invention that was created out of a need of communities to have a place where they can practice or show up as a community instead of a temple. Jews, no matter if we define them as Jews, descendants of Israel, because historically speaking, we know as a fact that Jews today are composed of many, many different tribes, and not just Jews. This is a mistake that is promoted by people who have very specific agendas. I can vouch to you as a person who's done courses and studied a lot about this material that many parts of the 10 tribes did remain in the land of Israel, did stay with the Jewish people, did return to the land later on, and many also scattered around. But to say Jews are only Judah is a mistake, because, for example, I'm a Levite. Ani Levi. My family name is Halevi. It's a family title. It's been a family title for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. And the point is that there are mentions, for example, the book of Judith, people in the tribe of Shimon. If I may borrow for a second from the New Testament, Paul says that he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Do I trust Paul or not? That's not the point. The point is that there's someone who recognizes himself as the tribe of Benjamin. There are mentionings in the Tanakh of people who came from the northern tribes to join Judah. We know that Jerusalem, archaeologically speaking, Jerusalem was refortified during the siege of Sanherib on Jerusalem to accommodate people who fled from the north. There's a lot of information out there that proves that Jews today are composed from all 12 tribes and not just Judah, or just Judah, Binyamin, and Levi. There are legends about Jeremiah bringing back some of the tribes. We know the tribes were not really lost. There's a lot of things here about the history of it, but there are also people who carried on, people who vanished. So are the 10 tribes out there? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are those who scattered, and no, in the sense of that some of them also joined the Jews, joined the Judeans, the people of Judah, because Yehuda, Mamlechet Yehuda, Judea, which is by the way a Roman name, but the concept of the Jew, for example, which is mentioned in the inscriptions of Sanherib, he says that he trapped Hezekiah the Jew. It's more of a reference of the area you live in, not your tribe. Okay, so it's not limited to a specific tribe, it's limited to a location. Jew was a person who lived in the province of Judea, the Roman province of Judea, which included a lot of different people. So you have to be very careful historically when you deal with this subject. But Jews, I'm going to use that term for now, Jews living in Egypt, in Babylon, in Syria, in Asia Minor, they needed a place to commune in. So there's a debate between scholars regarding the creation of the synagogue. Was it invented in the land of Israel, or was it invented outside? But even if it was invented in the land of Israel, I have to remember that the temple was far away for everyone. And people needed a place to do service. People need a place that they can feel part of something. Today, we have the same issue in the United States. If I live in Israel, I have synagogues all over the place. And even if I don't belong to any specific community or any specific synagogue, I have a place I can go to. I have something I can be connected to because this is the state of the Jews, which is, by the way, why we were given this country. Or the mistake that people make around the world regarding the state of Israel is that this is a place for Jews to live in. Yes, it's against what most countries do today, but that's only in Europe and Northern America. Okay? In Asia, in Africa, in South America, which is the majority of the world, these are ethnic countries, more or less. They have immigration to some degree or another, but you go to Asia and Africa, even people who immigrate there, they're foreigners. They're always going to be foreigners. So there's this stupidity regarding the state of Israel. Oh, Israel's an apartheid. Yeah, well, go to other countries as well. Do me a favor. They might treat you well, but at the end of the day, you're a foreigner. Okay? So the thing is that they were living in these different places, far away from the temple, and they needed somewhere to commune, somewhere that they can study Torah, somewhere that they can feel something. And this is where prayer comes in. The synagogue is a unique thing. Because in the ancient world, if you had a place that you prayed in, that usually was your temple. Synagogue didn't have sacrifices, didn't have the same practices in the other temples. It was a place that was mostly for studying Torah and praying. So it was a very, very unique concept. And because it was a unique concept, they also started taking other ideas, like, for example, having to have a community, a group of 10 men to pray together. Because the idea of the synagogue was to create a communal center, to create a place for everyone to congregate. And that's the place where men, mostly men, would show up. Most of the service in the temple is men. You know, it says, this is the commandment about the three feasts. It's mostly targeted towards men. So men are in the center of all of it. Doesn't mean women are not. Chana, for example, shows up at the temple. Women show up at the temple all the time. Women will go to the prophet to speak with the prophet. It's not, there's no segregation here. But men were the ones who were mostly expected, because men were usually the patrons of the family. But we do find some cases of women being patrons. For example, Yoav ben Tzeruya, he's named after his mother. And that's because his mother was the patron. So, but we are talking about the old world. This is a different mentality. And the thing that comes up is that the structure, the whole idea of how prayer is to be practiced is something that was created separate from the temple as a separate new entity, and therefore had its own rules, gave in its own rules. Things were basically invented on the spot, more or less, based on probably some vague concepts that they can pull out from the Tanakh, but the idea itself of the synagogue and the idea of public prayer and the idea of liturgy and so on is something that was created separately from the temple, and therefore had its own separate rules. And therefore its rules cannot be found in the Torah either, because it is an invention of the Second Temple period. It is a pure Jewish invention. According to Professor Uriel Rapaport, which I read his material about the Second Temple period, he clearly states that it is the understanding of most scholars, and again, obviously you're going to have scholars that disagree with one another, but it is the understanding of most scholars that prayer and synagogue and liturgy of synagogue is a specific, unique concept, special to Jews in the Second Temple period, that it exists separately from the temple, but not as a competition against the temple. It is to answer a difficulty that most people had with the fact that they don't have a temple nearby. So, if he's right, that answers the question of the structure of the prayer, the structure of the synagogue, how things were led and so on, because it was a separate entity. It was something they had to invent, and therefore should not be discussed even inside the parameters of Tanakh and the parameters of the Torah. These are some important topics, and obviously there are probably things I haven't spoken about yet, but I think that if people comment or send questions and develop this, we can develop this even more. I think, just to sum this up, I think prayer is an important part of our relationship with God. I think prayer is one of the expressions of emotion that we have. I think that it is an important part of our existence as people of faith. I think we should pray. I think that many people throughout the thousands of years of the keeping of Torah prayed. David prayed. The book of Psalms appears out of a world of prayer. We find prayers throughout the entire Tanakh. And I think the answer is we are supposed to pray. We are expected to pray. Why? Prayer is the petition before our King. Prayer is the petition before our God. It is one of the ways for us to express on a personal level our acceptance of God, our acceptance of His rulership over us, our acceptance of the covenant, by the fact that we turn around to Him and we request, we ask, it's a recognition of His power. It is a recognition of His authority. It is a recognition of His love and His care to us. And this is why we're supposed to pray. No matter what state we're in, clean, unclean, in the exile, in the land, standing in the temple, high priest standing in the Holy of Holies. Prayer is the way for us to express our needs. The Torah gives us the generalized things that we have to do as part of our covenant. But does it tell us that, when you need help with money, or when you need help with this or that, or when you need your fields to prosper, does it tell you how to do it? No. It expects you to have the sensibility to recognize the fact that you need to turn around to God as well. We have all these practices and so on. This is where we have the personal realm. So prayer originally was a personal thing, was in the public sphere only in very specific occasions. And it is that one little place that we have our personal discussion with God. And that's the way I understand it. So again, please make comments. Please send me emails. I want to develop this subject a little more. But I hope it's covered at least some of the questions people have had. Again, I usually present things in a generalized way, and then if things come up, we open up even more. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it answers some of the questions that you have. And hopefully this will help people understand the concept of prayer even more. Thank you.